Hello, be most welcome to this webinar of Bússola Tech regarding the digital transformation in the legislative power in Latin America. Legislative houses are the frontier for the public sector modernization and digitalization in the lawmaking process and the oversight of public policy implementation. To promote changes required for a digital-ready legislature, civil servants must exert leadership in the process of change and also rely on the interparliamentary cooperation with other legislatures and the private sector. In this debate, Bússola Tech brings to life how this process is taking place in Latin America and what are the next steps after the effort to ensure the continuity of legislative business during the pandemic with the remote deliberation solutions. Today, I have the pleasure to welcome here today Alisha Todd from Parlamericas, Gustavo Sabóia from the Brazilian Senate House, Juan Manuel Cheppi from the Argentina House of Representatives, and Nicolas Andrade from Zoom. Today, my goal here is to understand the next steps after the remote deliberation solutions were implemented in 2020. How can this process can mean a significant change and modernization for legislatures, meaning a more effective legislative process and a more effective parliamentary activity. Alisha, I'd like to start with you to hear your thoughts. We have seen a remarkable ability of Parliament in the Americas to adapt to the restrictions of the ongoing COVID-19 crisis and to maintain the functioning of the legislative process. As I said in my opening remarks, looking beyond the necessity for remote and hybrid sessions, what are the next steps for parliaments in the region to develop a digital transformation strategy?
Such a pleasure to be here, Luís. As always, I love this opportunity to be with you. And I'd like to say hello to my colleagues, Juan Manuel Cheppi from Argentina and Gustavo Sabóia from Brazil, as well as Nicolas, who I just got to meet and who has connections to Canada, which is wonderful. As always, it's a pleasure to be here. Look, this panel is timely as we recently undertook a meeting of our Parliamentary Staff Network on Open Parliament, which is the network that convenes legislative staff from across the Americas and the Caribbean. The focus this year was on technological innovation, ongoing trends, and experiences in the region. We were grateful, actually, because we had Mr. Cheppi participate in that space, and he presented on Argentina's experience on virtual sittings. And we also had representation from the Congress of Brazil. It's this kind of sharing of information and experiences that helps advance the progress in our countries and in the parliaments. The COVID-19 pandemic, without a doubt, has accelerated the process of digital transformation for parliaments throughout the hemisphere. Though these processes or discussions about the need for these processes have been taking place for many years. The urgency caused by the pandemic catalyzed necessity, and with it, the political will required for digital transformation processes to become institutionalized. And now that it has happened, we have no expectation that parliaments will return to pre-pandemic practices and stop using the ICT tools they now have. As discussed in previous sessions that I've joined you in, these have and will improve the efficiency of Parliament. These have implications for improving how parliamentarians and parliamentary staff can work, very importantly, reducing barriers to women as well as men to balance their family and care work responsibilities with the professional responsibilities. The benefits are many. Based on their experience over the years and the rapid shift to more innovative practices caused by the pandemic, parliamentary representatives emphasize three key reflections for building sustainable digital transformation strategies. Ensuring effective processes to collect and review the types and quality of data generated and used when applying digital tools to increase the efficiency of parliamentary practices. Undertaking capacity building and technical training for both parliamentarians and parliamentary staff so that they can effectively use those tools. And safeguarding for the ethical use of ICTs and ensuring the security of parliamentary data and systems. Many efforts to digitize parliamentary work have to do with improving transparency and access to information, to not only provide this information to the public, but also to keep improving the efficiency of parliamentary procedures. For example, having electronic systems in place to record and publish parliamentarians' attendance, voting records, using voice transcription tools to render meeting recordings into written form. These measures will render the procedural aspects of the discussion and debates of bills, both in committee and in plenary, more efficient. And when this data is published, preferably confirming with open data principles, it contributes to the transparency of the process and makes it easier for interested citizens to follow the process without the expectation that they will sit and watch all of these sessions. Because many parliaments do currently put sessions online, but we also need to follow up with those tools that allow us to take that data and disseminate it in a way that's more usable for citizens. And so what we heard from the parliamentary staff as we kind of look at the sustainability of this transition, it's just they need to really be conscious about how to collect the data, review its quality, consider how many data sets are available, determine the format in which it's being published, all of which requires coordination. Mapping out the flow of information can enable better planning and help identify bottlenecks or challenges in information processing. Parliaments have made the transition to virtual sittings, who have made this transition shared that for users, it was a big adaptation process. And so for this reason, you need training both for parliamentary staff and parliamentarians. And that training cannot be limited to just people who work in the technology and innovation departments. Parliamentary staff also noted the importance of technology employed to follow certain processes and criteria to ensure its consistency, integrity, and security. We discussed the use of artificial intelligence, which is starting to be used more commonly by parliaments, for example, through algorithms and public participation platforms to help more easily highlight trends or key public concerns. But when developing such algorithms, it's important to consider what type of information is used to feed these systems, as the selection of the data can replicate societal biases by making certain information invisible or overvaluing other types of information. For example, we've seen that AI tools such as facial recognition or voice recognition software can be biased and not work as effectively on darker skin tones or certain accents. And this is important to keep in mind when developing tools. These considerations go hand in hand with also taking cybersecurity very seriously to protect personal information and mitigate against virtual attacks, like the recent cyber attacks against the parliament in Colombia. So we likewise heard in our meetings that it's important to monitor threats, to have a plan in place to deal with consequences of such attacks if they take place, and to involve both parliamentarians and parliamentary staff in protecting measures, making sure these are covered in training sessions so that they can take proper precautions as well.
Thank you, Alisha, for your considerations. Certainly the leadership of Parlamericas in creating this forum in the Inter-American system is being very helpful in order for parliaments to share this expertise, not only as big parliaments such as the Brazilian Senate House or the Argentinian House of Representatives, but to smaller parliaments that don't have the digital capacity that has been built for many decades in other legislatures. Speaking of which, Gustavo, in 2020, the Brazilian Senate House showed a remarkable leadership in its digital capacity by implementing the first remote deliberation system alongside the Brazilian House of Representatives. To those that are not familiar with the story, the system was implemented in only 7 days after it was directed by the President of the Senate. I'd like to deep dive with you on the next step and priority for you as the Secretary General of the Board. Could you please share your views on which priorities the Senate House should have in moving forward with this digital transformation process?
First of all, I would like to state that it is a great honor to take part in this discussion today, alongside with my colleagues, Alisha, Todd, Juan, Manuel, and Nicolas, Andrade. And I would like also to thank Luís specifically and Bússola Tech for this opportunity to share some of our knowledge and also benefit from the knowledge and the experience of other parliaments and other professionals throughout the world. I do understand that sharing knowledge and learning from one another, especially when we talk about parliaments, is usually very important. But under the pandemic, which is a very harsh circumstance that hits us all in very similar ways, it becomes even more important since we are all facing pretty much the same problems all over the world. So if we have similar problems, it is very reasonable to think that we can find also similar solutions. So I do think that this kind of discussion takes an even greater importance during these contexts. That being said, as we stated, we do proudly acknowledge that the Brazilian Congress has taken a leadership in this digital transformation process. We firmly believe that the remote deliberation system implemented, as we mentioned, in just 7 days, has helped us keep our democracy alive and well last year, despite all the political and operational challenges we all faced. And we can never take that for granted. Just looking back at last year, by March, when everyone started to realize in Brazil the seriousness of the pandemic and how hard the pandemic would hit the country, two legal actions were presented at our Supreme Court, and they both addressed the question of legislative production during the pandemic. They both tried to find solutions for this matter, and they basically proposed the same solution, which was by different means to allow the executive branch to produce autonomous pieces of legislation during the pandemic. And this would have been the easy way to go. And I do think that this solution would have been adopted if it weren't for, I understand, three factors that allowed the Brazilian Congress to quickly develop a remote deliberation system and keep exercising its duties, its attributions. And the first reason why we were able to develop such system is that we had already an ongoing digitalization process in the parliament. We were working with digital documents, data security. We still have a very up-to-date website and very functional website, and very good technological infrastructure. So this first factor is crucial because we did not have to come up with a system from scratch. We already have a process going on, so we only had to take it a few steps further in order to develop the system. Another important factor, of course, is the new possibilities that was brought by new technology. If you think historically, whenever a crisis of such proportions took place, the easiest way to deal with the crisis was basically to shut down Congress and allow the executive branch or whoever was in charge of that to make the decisions faster and more effectively. But with technology, we could bring congressmen virtually together to keep working. And another very important factor, and I think it touches a lot of what Alisha mentioned, was the commitment of the parliamentary leadership and Congress civil servants to develop that system. There was, and these two worked together, there was a very clear decision from the political leadership at that point, but also not only goodwill of civil servants at the Senate, but also they were technically trained to develop that system. But again, this basically due to the ongoing digitalization process that was already in place. However, the deliberation system that has allowed the Brazilian Congress to keep working, introducing and passing important legislation to deal with the pandemic crisis is a limited system. It was conceived at that point to function for, I don't know, 60, 90 days, which was by then how long we thought the pandemic would endure, but would last. But now that the pandemic endures, we are being forced to expand the capacities of that system. And in terms of next step, I would mention this to be our greatest challenge at the moment and our next step, so to speak. We are discussing how the Senate committees right now will work remotely. So not only our main deliberative body will function, but over this month we do expect that the Senate committees will begin to work remotely. Over the last month, we solved technical issues to expand our remote system, and we're now adapting our internal rules so we can fit the committees in the deliberation system. So as a part of the digitalization, as a part of the process, we are concluding the process of digitalizing all of our documents. We do expect that to happen by the end of this year. And while all of that is still really connected to the pandemic reality, we do expect that many of these changes will come to stay. So we are already thinking on the after, on the reality after the pandemic, and how can we expand the system and put it to work properly after the pandemic ends.
Thank you, Gustavo. That's a remarkable job the Brazilian Senate House has been doing, both during the pandemic and also before the pandemic. Most recently, I think the IT team from the Senate House is called Prodazen. They launched a new app for the Senate. If I'm not mistaken, the name in Portuguese is Senado Digital. I think you can find them in both app stores. And it's a really interesting app, so I highly recommend everyone to download it and to use it, because you can actually see and follow the legislative process, something that has been digitalized a very long while ago, which provided the Senate the tools to actually remote deliberate in such a fast manner. Juan, I'd like to pose a similar question I brought Gustavo to you as well. The Argentina House of Representatives recently created the Select Committee for the Modernization of Congress to bring forward ideas on how to tackle the challenges our legislatures have in their daily activities in the legislative process. I'd like to bring you the same question I brought to the Secretary Sabóia. Could you please share your views and priorities the House of Representatives should have in moving forward in its digital transformation?
Muy buenas tardes y gracias por la invitación a esta charla. A Alisha, a Gustavo, a Luís, a Nicolas y a los que nos están viendo. Sí, voy a comenzar por un poco remontarnos a cuándo comenzó la gestión que nos tocó asumir en la Cámara de Diputados de la Argentina. Fue en el cambio de gobierno en diciembre de 2019. Asumimos la conducción de la Cámara de Diputados junto al presidente de la Cámara, Sergio Massa, y en ese momento era uno de los grandes motivos de transformación, la digitalización y modernización de la Cámara, sin imaginarnos lo que iba a comenzar en nuestro caso con el aislamiento a mediados del mes de marzo del año pasado, que bueno, aceleró y generó que muchos programas, como también recién contaba Gustavo en el Senado brasilero, que se venían dando naturalmente y quizá con un tiempo más lento, permitieron acelerarse y profundizarse y hoy proponer nuevos desafíos a futuro, de los cuales quizá eran inimaginables cuando asumimos la gestión. Para dar un solo ejemplo concreto, la Cámara de Diputados consta de 257 integrantes, diputadas y diputados. En diciembre de 2019 solamente 4 diputados tenían firma digital. Hoy ya es la totalidad del cuerpo que tiene la firma digital y también los secretarios de comisión y todo el trabajo que se dio con diferentes actores que tienen firma en el proceso legislativo. Otra de las cuestiones para contar, que es un poco la pregunta a la cual venía, la Cámara ya tenía un programa de modernización a cargo de una dirección dentro de la parte administrativa, digamos, y también había una comisión que se había creado en el año 2016, que estaba apagada, digamos. Eso es una comisión legislativa conformada por diputados y diputadas, que, bueno, al momento de comenzar la pandemia y el aislamiento, se aceleró y se conformó en una mesa de trabajo multipartidaria, que para mí también es muy importante, más allá de que hoy tengamos un rol de gestión. Yo fui diputado a nivel estadual, provincial, es para mí muy importante la cuestión política, para recalcar. La Cámara de Diputados de la Argentina no hay una mayoría absoluta por ninguno, ni oficialismo ni oposición, lo cual construir el consenso y el protocolo de trabajo remoto y virtual requirió de mucho esfuerzo y de mucho consenso y diálogo político. Así fue como a partir de marzo, como les decía, llegamos a hoy, a lo que va a ser dentro de un año, el 13 de mayo, la primera sesión virtual, y eso la verdad trajo aparejado un desafío muy grande, tanto en capacitación, como decía Alisha al principio, la incorporación de tener mucha paciencia y un trabajo muy arduo con los diputados y diputadas que quizás no estaban ayornados al uso de la tecnología, y eso es algo que quiero destacar. Se hizo pura y exclusivamente con trabajadores de la Cámara, trabajadores de planta, de línea, y creo también que permite que hoy esta comisión de modernización tenga nuevos desafíos que son qué es lo que queda post pandemia instaurado y cómo se va a modificar también el reglamento incorporando el uso de tecnología. Nada va a reemplazar la presencialidad y el debate cara a cara en el recinto, pero sí creo que tanto como el uso de la firma digital y empezar a despapelizar el proceso legislativo y hacerlo todo digital, son algunas de las cuestiones que han quedado y que hay también dejarlas por escrito, y es lo que se está trabajando hoy mismo en la Cámara de Diputados con los diferentes bloques políticos. Fundamentalmente, el funcionamiento en comisiones creo que es el mayor cambio que vamos a tener. La virtualidad permitió que se trabajara lunes o viernes, que, como también conocen en Brasil, las dimensiones de nuestros países hacen que el viaje hacia Brasilia, en el caso de Brasil, o a la capital federal, Buenos Aires, requiera que los diputados y legisladores y legisladoras tengan que venir martes, miércoles y jueves casi siempre, y vuelvan el viernes al lunes a sus ciudades. Esto permitió tener comisiones, primero con un alto nivel de presencialidad, un viernes a las 7 de la tarde, algo que era impensado en el pasado, y que creemos que tenemos que permitir que esto quede instaurado como una regla y un avance en el funcionamiento. También permitiendo que los legisladores y legisladoras puedan también estar mucho más en sus estados, en sus ciudades, cerca de sus representados, y no perdiendo el tiempo también en viajes hacia la capital federal, hacia Buenos Aires, permitiendo también un ahorro en viáticos, en hospedaje. Creemos que reitero, la presencialidad en el debate, en la Cámara, en el recinto, en la sesión, es irreemplazable, pero sí en el trabajo remoto en la semana es algo que vino para quedarse y algunos de los puntos que después vamos a desarrollar y seguir contando, pero creo que era uno de los ejes que quería destacar lo que nos dejó este año de pandemia.
Thank you, Juan. It's actually very interesting, some of the aspects you brought. There are some similarities we see in other legislatures as well, such as the increased quorum in the meetings and in the sessions as well in remote working. And Argentina, just as Brazil and just as Canada, we are huge countries that usually members take hours, if not in some cases. I was talking to Gustavo earlier today, and basically some members take more than 1 day to reach to their electoral district. So we are talking about valuing the time of the member. We are talking about lowering the costs for the legislature on saving public resources on airplane tickets, on housing and other costs as well. And we must be mindful as well of the carbon footprint that are being saved here during eventual remote workings. I agree with Gustavo and Juan. We should not take remote workings as granted, because the nature of the parliament is for people to meet. But maybe some of the meetings can be in a hybrid session or or even in a remote fashion, but not as a standard. Speaking of which, Nicolas, I'd like to bring you a question as well. Bússola Tech mapped that different parliament houses, whether in Latin America or in other countries, both at the national and subnational level, that the video conferencing solution chosen during the pandemic for remote deliberations is Zoom. Considering all considerations brought by Mr. Sabóia and by Mr. Cheppi and by Mrs. Todd, after the pandemic, how can a platform like Zoom continue to support the legislative branch in its digital transformation?
I would argue that it makes sense, and I think in that sense, I would agree with my fellow speakers that this digital transformation should continue, right? Even as we're seeing some countries emerge from the worst parts of this terrible pandemic, we see hybrid workforces continuing and being more permanent in the workforce and in institutions like congresses. In LATAM, as some of my fellow speakers said, the distances are so huge, but also more productive to hold part of these sessions on Zoom. I was going to bring the example of the possibility of working Mondays and Fridays, but Juan Manuel did it for me, I think even with more legitimacy. The fact that so many of our parliaments can only fully function on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, given the enormous geographic distances in many of our countries, is a limiting factor. And of course, the reality is that now we can be more productive and members of Congress can participate, for instance, on a Friday afternoon, if they choose to do so, in a virtual encounter, enabling them to spend more time with their constituents, less time traveling, and saving money at the end of the day for Congress and their budgets in terms of travel fees and in terms of hotel stays and so on. I'd like to end this initial part just by talking a little bit, not too much, about some of the Zoom products that I think could be useful in this journey of digital transformation. The first one are Zoom apps. Many people know Zoom because of the webinars tool that we're using today, or because of the meetings tool, but we're an integrated, unified communications as a service platform. And that means that we have more things to offer than just that. And I'll give you some examples. Zoom apps allow you to integrate your Zoom service with other platforms like, for example, Dropbox or Slack or Microsoft Teams or many others, which allow people to, for instance, collaborate on the same document without leaving the Zoom window. Our Zoom phone service allows you to transition legacy technology and phone lines over to a cloud-based IP phone system, Zoom Phone, which is efficient and easier to manage from a central location by teams, IT teams like those in Congresses. And thirdly, our Zoom Rooms solution allows you to equip any small room or large room, whether it's a huddle room or a large training hall, into a professional and modern video conferencing room with professional screens, microphones, and cameras that will enable you to connect instantly anywhere around the world, start a meeting just with voice commands, and enable your organization to hold internal and external meetings, whether they're domestic or international, more efficiently. So I'll leave it at that, Luís. I'm really glad to be here with you guys. And as I said, I hope this is the beginning of a much longer debate and discussion on how Zoom can help in the digital transformation of these organizations that are so symbolic of democracy in the region.
I got a glimpse of a few very interesting remarks on your presentation that basically, there's a long discussion we had in 2020 that if the pandemic took place 20 years ago or 30 years ago, how could Parliament maintain its functioning and avoiding the spread of the new coronavirus between members? I argued that solutions just as Zoom and other video conference platforms helped Parliament not only maintain its functioning in the legislative process, but as my colleagues referred earlier today, they also help to maintain democracy itself. It helped to keep the executive branch in check. So Parliament, there is a motto that the Senate House in Brazil used in 2020 that I like. It's in times of pandemic, the Parliament cannot stop. And I think that tells us a lot of what took place in the past few months, in the past year, and how a solution like Zoom could be a part and could help in this process. Alisha, I'd like to catch something that Nicolas shared and ask you a question. And as he mentioned, as we know, parliaments are traditional institutions. So we have seen globally that Westminster model parliaments easily adapted their bylaws to the reality of remote work, although they had some challenges in finding a common ground between a digital-ready reality and their traditional processes. We have also seen that other parliament houses had difficulty in using remote solutions due to the limitation in their bylaws and even the constitution sometimes. Looking beyond the necessity of hybrid and remote meetings during COVID, what are your thoughts on modernizing the bylaws from parliaments in the region?
I mean, as Gustavo and Juan have already alluded to, right? I mean, it takes a lot of effort. It took a lot of political capital to get the parliamentarians or ready to want to do these, take on these innovations. And we saw leadership for Brazil for years. And so we were so grateful from Brazil that they were able to then go out and share of their experience in those technologies across the hemisphere. In particular, they even shared within the Caribbean, which doesn't have the same access to these tools. So the political will bit, the pandemic, as I said, catalyzed this, which is fantastic. I guess what we're hoping to see now is that was the big push that you needed to open up these discussions for what will be complex conversations about how to update the regulatory frameworks in these parliaments. And in fact, whereas in the Westminster systems, some of these were done very quickly, a lot of them still run into issues around, around, as you say, their constitution, or they were able to put in provisions that are currently temporary because they could point to the global health pandemic for the rationale for, allowing electronic voting or moving to hybrid systems. But now, can they codify this in a more permanent way? I mean, Parlamericas represents, we bring together parliaments from across the hemisphere. So I often have to speak very much in just a general sense to try and capture all of these parliaments that are big, small, and at different stages of their own developments. What we're hoping to see, and certainly the space where we're working in this space, is to try and make sure that parliaments, as they go through what is already, I'm saying it's a big thing to open up your standing orders or open up the constitutional framework of your parliament, like what are the rules in place. That takes a lot of effort, long debate, political buy-in, etc. That as they're doing this, that they should be thinking in the long term. right? So that when they look at these measures aren't, or they really need to be having a debate on, and discussions on, are these measures just for a crisis scenario, for continuity of business during crisis? Or, as I think we're already hearing from these parliaments, and as I'm hearing from other parliaments, is this actually now the catalyst that makes us look at the modernization process long term, right? I do think there's going to be a lot of benefit, and we're hearing from everyone that the parliamentarians, the parliaments, they understand the benefits of some of these tools that they've taken on. So they took them on in a crisis, but now is the opportunity to make sure that they can maybe use these longer term. And I think we've all come into agreement there, right? The travel, the work-life balance for parliamentarians, parliamentary staff, these create lots of barriers. In particular, we do a lot of work in gender equality. It creates barriers for women wanting to enter politics, right? Because of the traditional kind of relationship between care work and professional work. New generations of men also, though, by the way, want to have more relationships with their families. They want that balance as well, right? I mean, so I think we're seeing this as a real opportunity. It is going to be, though, about how to systematically make sure that you put this into the parliaments in a way that allows them to be sustainable over time. I alluded to some points earlier where the staff are pointing out to really this issue around making sure that they could take considerations. So not just about hybrid meetings, which I think will be important, which are important, but then all kind of the ancillary tools that go with that, the data security, the making sure that you really codify procedures and processes within that to ensure that this can be done professionally. I believe now was Gustavo saying, like, over the long term, sustainable, right? So that it's not just for one moment in time. How can they expand it so that it can affect more parts of the parliaments, right? So right now, in a lot of parliaments, they were only, they made provisions, but it meant that there's a number of committees that aren't meeting, right? Because they're still in an emergency scenario, and so they've limited the amount of committee work to just deal with emergency things, and that's how they're getting by. Well, if you want to maintain these systems, are you going to maintain them in a way that actually then expands them so that all parts of parliament can function now utilizing these new hybrid systems? So I think there's just a lot of work to be done. We do encourage then, there's also a lot of opportunity for interparliamentary collaboration in this space, from a sharing from where you're seeing in one jurisdiction how they're approaching these changes to their frameworks, and that they can share it then with other counterpart parliaments to kind of learn from that. And so it creates this wonderful leapfrogging effect. So leaders like Brazil, like Argentina, are sharing then with other parliaments, say in El Salvador and Honduras, in time, so that they can take of that learning and move forward more quickly in applying these solutions.
Juan Manuel, I'd like to pose you a question following up this question I posed to Alisha and on her remarks as well. A digital transformation strategy must be in compliance to the internal rules of the House. We all know the rules of the House is a set of rules built over time by reaching consensus between the different political leaders acting in the House. In your view, which aspects of the rules of the House still require a careful revision to enable further modernization in the legislative process? And what are those that were already modified during the COVID-19 pandemic? Possible changes that were made during the pandemic that enabled the continuity of the legislatures, such as remote and hybrid sessions, should remain as a possibility for the future as well.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias. Bueno, un poco lo comenté en la primera respuesta. Fundamentalmente en el proceso de comisiones y de trabajo legislativo durante la semana, eso es lo que estamos apuntando a que quede de forma establecida por reglamento, al mismo tiempo que la posibilidad de que los proyectos de ley, los proyectos de resolución, también puedan ser firmados con firma digital. Eso hasta ahora solamente se hace en papel y presentándolo en la mesa de entradas acá en Buenos Aires. Son cosas que ya han quedado y la verdad se instalaron de una forma que va a ser muy difícil volver atrás. Ahora lo que nos queda es el trabajo, que no es menor, de generar consenso en cambiar el reglamento y permitir que que existe esta posibilidad de trabajar más que nada en comisiones, en el trabajo legislativo durante la semana. Así también tener en cuenta que en algunos casos poder permitir que algunas sesiones, si hay un acuerdo político entre los presidentes de bloque, sean también de forma virtual. Muchas veces hay sesiones que no son con temas que tienen una discusión muy intensa, sino que son también proyectos de ley, de declaración, de reconocimiento, que pueden ser sesiones que se acuerden de forma unánime. Eso es importantísimo aclararlo, que tiene que haber consenso de todo el arco político para que también se puedan dar sesiones de forma mixta, porque la verdad que los que pueden venir lo hacen y los que no lo hacen desde su casa, y eso es como estamos funcionando hoy. Durante todo el 2020 en pandemia se trabajó más que en 2019 en la Cámara de Diputados. Tuvimos más de 20 sesiones, más de 91 proyectos de ley aprobados, más de 320 reuniones de comisión, vinieron representantes del Ejecutivo y diferentes organizaciones de forma virtual, y eso permitió también un trabajo mucho más profundo, como les decía, en comisión, en el trabajo legislativo durante las semanas. Y todo esto se dio en un marco de mucha mayor transparencia. Creo que la modernización y la digitalización traen aparejado mucha más contacto con el ciudadano, mucho más ida y vuelta, y el estar mucho más expuesto. Hoy se puede ver por YouTube, tenemos el canal de Diputados TV, todas las comisiones, todas las sesiones, y como decía Alisha también al principio, toda esta digitalización de los datos de trabajo parlamentario requieren ahora de un proceso también de ordenamiento. Venimos implementando un motor de búsqueda con inteligencia artificial para la digitalización de todos los discursos, la oratoria que se da en el recinto, pero también todos los proyectos actuales y también 100 años para atrás. Estamos digitalizando toda la historia de nuestro Congreso y volcándole un sistema de inteligencia artificial para no solo buscar por keywords o por tags, sino también por conceptos y por ideas, y poder evaluar, comparar cuáles son las palabras o los discursos o las temáticas más utilizadas en la década del 30, en la década del 80 o en la actualidad. Ver también cuáles son los temas que tienen determinados grupos parlamentarios y que traen aparejados. Eso es algo de lo que la verdad entusiasma, y son cosas que van quedando. Hemos tomado también el ejemplo del laboratorio de innovación que tiene la Cámara de Diputados en Brasil. También estuvimos en contacto con el Senado. Fue el último viaje que hicimos pre-pandemia en marzo del año pasado. En ese momento nos recibió el presidente de la Cámara de Diputados, Rodrigo Maia, y también pudimos intercambiar y ver el avance que tiene el sistema legislativo brasilero, que también fue un eje para nosotros de ejemplo. Y también creo muy importante la cuestión, primero, de la soberanía de los datos y de una gran inversión que estamos haciendo en un data center propio para, como Cámara de Diputados nacional, brindarle a las diferentes legislaturas provinciales y consejos municipales tecnología para que puedan trabajar. Eso es algo que estamos implementándolo ahora, brindándole una nube propia para que puedan trabajar con nuestro sistema de gestión parlamentaria digital. Y también un trabajo muy fuerte en ciberseguridad. Aplicamos en el proceso de voto la generación de un PDF que vuelca en la red de blockchain federal de la Argentina. Implementamos blockchain para el voto y también para el quórum. En cada sesión, cuando se conforma el quórum, está avalado por la red de blockchain en nuestro país. Y al mismo tiempo hicimos un convenio con el Registro Nacional de las Personas que permite, previo a cada ingreso del diputado o diputada al recinto virtual, que sea con una foto, con prueba de vida y movimiento, para asegurarnos que es el diputado o la diputada la que está dando el quórum, y previo a cada votación también se hace este proceso. Así que son algunas de las cuestiones que llegaron para quedarse, creemos que es el lado positivo que nos deja este momento difícil que estamos viviendo, pero entendemos que hay un antes y un después en la cuestión de implementar la tecnología para mejorar la democracia, e insisto, creo que el mayor valor que nos deja esto es más transparencia y mucha más cercanía con el ciudadano. Les puedo contar el portal de leyes abiertas, que es para que los ciudadanos también puedan modificar los proyectos de ley. Cada diputado puede presentar proyectos abiertos a la ciudadanía, eso se está dando, y también un gran trabajo de datos abiertos, que eso es una agenda que venimos trabajando con la agenda del Parlamento abierto con diferentes organizaciones, y eso también requiere de organizar todas las áreas y poder convencer a los trabajadores y trabajadoras de la Cámara que están agarrados quizá a viejas tecnologías, que la tecnología les va a permitir mejorar y poder mostrar mucho mejor su trabajo. Eso fue un proceso de cambio y de resistencia que hubo y que es natural con las áreas de línea, de planta permanente de la Cámara, que bueno, también requirió de un esfuerzo de convencer y demostrar que pueden hacer uso de la tecnología para mejorar cómo muestran y cómo es visto el trabajo de todos ellos. Así que un poco era eso la idea que quería dejar bien en claro, y desde ya agradecerles esta oportunidad de poder compartir esta experiencia, Alisha, Gustavo, Nicolas y Luis, permitir también dejar la puerta abierta para invitarlos a Buenos Aires cuando puedan, y serán bien recibidos, y espero que esto pase pronto para poder intercambiar estas experiencias también mano a mano y cara a cara. Así que muchas gracias.
Gustavo, I'd like to come back to the question I posed to Juan Manuel, focusing on the compliance of a digital transformation strategy and the internal rules of the House. These possible changes that were made during the pandemic, do you think they should continue in the internal rules of the House, or they require even further changes? Or shouldn't we change the internal rules and use only ad hoc instruments to answer to the crisis of COVID, and only then discuss actual changes? What do you think about how can the internal rules of the House can be in compliance with a digital transformation strategy?
Well, Luis, I think this is a very, I would say, very technical, very complicated question. Our remote deliberation system was created by an act of the Senate board. This basically means we did not change our statute permanently, but we approved a specific act in order to regulate the system during the pandemic. This act that approved last year has not the same hierarchy of the other bylaws and our internal statutes. And even at the beginning, some people questioned its validity, but eventually it was even recognized by the Supreme Court. But all of this formal aspects, they do translate into a more material matter, which is the intrinsic connection of the system to the pandemic, at least this time. If we were having this discussion March or April last year, thinking about creating a remote deliberation system, and without the context of a pandemic or a permanent remote deliberation system, I think the outcome or the acceptation would have been entirely different. I don't think that senators, congressmen, and even the judiciary would accept a permanent remote deliberation system. But at that point, again, it appeared as a lifeboat. And this is the image I like to use. You were on a cruise ship, the ship is sinking, and we need a lifeboat to survive. So you enter the lifeboat. But you're never going to book your vacations on a lifeboat. You want to have a bigger, better structure for you and, I don't know, your family. So this the element that brought validity, that stabilized the discussion over the remote deliberation system at that point were the extraordinary circumstances. And I would even say was that in addition to the extraordinary circumstances there was the expectation that it would not last long. I remember in April last year, we were thinking that the pandemic would last, I don't know, for 60, 90 days. And here we are, still having this very same conversation. But right now, we are discussing a new version of the act of the board to allow the system to be used by the committees, but also to allow the system in a more permanent way to be used whenever the regular and in-person systems are not available or possible. Again, there is already an expansion. We are not talking about specifically the pandemic, but we are talking about still extraordinary circumstances. And I do think that if we brought the issue of changing our statute at this point right now, again, this would not be widely accepted. There would be questioning, and some congressmen would definitely not feel comfortable to. And I think there's a great deal of reason in this thinking. They would not feel comfortable to make a permanent change in our statute during a pandemic or extraordinary circumstances. We don't know how the future will be, although I do fully agree with Nicolas that the future is hybrid, but we don't know what are the limitations going to be and especially how politicians will behave. We as civil servants, we have lots of expectations, and we are ourselves enthusiasts of new technologies and so forth and so on. But the politicians, they are the ones who will decide what will stay and what will not stay. But I do think that once the pandemic's over, this discussion will come around again, and we will have to settle, I believe, somewhere in the middle. There has always been a huge concern about the continuity of the parliamentary works and activities. If you look at our internal statute, there is a provision that allows Congress to meet outside or in a different place other than our regular duties. So there is, it shows the concern about the continuity of the activities. But this was the solution we could provide decades ago when the statute was written. It's really easy to think that we can pass new provisions stating that Congress can work remotely, either in extraordinary circumstances or in a hybrid mode. So I don't think this is going to be a major issue. My personal expectation is that the remote deliberation system and the hybrid system will be somehow embedded in our current procedures as alternatives in the future. If they will in fact be used, I mean, these two systems, it will be up, as I said, to the senators. But I do have reasons to believe that they have adapted quite well to these systems. They do feel the system is reliable, the way it records the meetings, the way it registers the votes. It does make the politicians feel comfortable. At least that's the feedback we have right now. There's also this feeling that Manuel has remarked that hybrid work can be more productive, especially in huge countries like Brazil, Canada, or Argentina. Again, I think we will discuss this later. There's a lot of personnel, and there's a lot of need of in-person meetings on the parliamentary activity. But it does, I mean, as an alternative, it does make sense to think that hybrid mode will be more productive and effective. But as for the other changes, digitalization of documents, digital signatures, website, digital procedures, I think this will all remain a part of our parliamentary daily lives and are already, I can say, embedded in our regular system.
Perfect, Gustavo. Thank you for your considerations. Nicolas, I'd like to have some of the concepts that Gustavo and Juan Manuel brought to the debate and deep dive on your previous answer. You were mentioning some of the features that Zoom could help on the legislative activities in the legislative process, even in times of normality or in times of pandemic, such as we live in. I remember quite vividly the Senate experience with the remote deliberation systems when they had, for example, parliamentarians using the phone call feature to participate in sessions where they did not have access to internet. Based on that, I'd like to know from you, what are the main features of a Zoom platform that can serve to further improve legislative activities?
Their infrastructure, security, and innovation. Okay, so starting with infrastructure, Zoom has a distributed global architecture that is unique to our company and which is built focusing on video. That is the reason why we have a 99.99% uptime and why we get the feedback from people all the time around the world that Zoom just works. Whether you're joining from a telephone, whether you're joining from a smartphone, from a computer, a Mac, a PC, whatever device, you just click and you can enter. But there's another really good reason why it is especially relevant in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is that Zoom is the best tool for use in low bandwidth environments, according not only to ourselves, but also to Wayne House Research that published a study on this topic recently. And that is extremely relevant because large amounts of territory and probably the majority of people in the region have access to something which would qualify as a low bandwidth environment. And as Juan Manuel was citing recently, this digital transformation has brought parliamentarians much closer to the population and to citizens, but in order to participate, of course, they need to be doing it on a tool that they can access with their internet connections. The second topic which I'm bringing here is security. Between December of 2019 and April of 2020, Zoom went from having 10 million people on meetings per day to having 300 million meetings per day. And with this unprecedented growth, we invested heavily in security. We actually froze all product development for 90 days and focused the entire company's efforts on security patches and work, which is why today we have the trust of not only governments, parliaments like yourselves, but also companies and people around the world who use our services even for meetings with friends and family members during this terrible pandemic. And I'll give you three concrete examples of the security work. The first one was that we acquired a Zoom, an encryption company, and we facilitated the installation of encryption, end-to-end encryption for both our free and our paid accounts. The second one is we led with waiting rooms and passwords, which nowadays in many accounts are mandatory, in which I assume you work with when working with parliaments. In the future, in the very near future, you'll be able to see not only the waiting room, the person in the waiting room, but a small icon of their video feed, just to triple check that that person is actually who they say they are. Again, another very useful feature when working with high visibility figures like parliamentarians. And the third one is the security button, which is available in the window of the meeting host. And that button allows you to easily mute a participant, remove an undesired participant, stop the screen sharing, or block the meeting, among other options so that nobody else can get in once the right amount of people are in the meeting. And that is always now on the bottom left of the Zoom window of whoever the administrator or the host is. So probably at this stage on this meeting, that would be you, Luís. And thirdly, innovation, right? As you've shown, innovation is not only the realm of small and nimble startups. Zoom allows people from the very beginning to choose their background. We just launched our immersive features, our immersive backgrounds, which I invite you to test. We launched reactions. I've seen politicians before use the backgrounds to highlight, for example, the natural beauty of the state or province in which they're elected. As I mentioned earlier, we've got Zoom marketplaces with our apps. We have the Zoom phone feature that allows you to integrate phone systems into our same platform. And we've got Zoom rooms that allow you to kit out a room and turn it into a professional conference room. Ever since I joined Zoom, I've seen just how much effort in the company goes to being innovative and bringing out new features responding to customer feedback. So you can count on us to always be taking out new features. Like last year, we took out over 300 without a single interruption in our service.
Thank you, Nicolas, for your considerations. Gustavo, I'd like to go back to with you. Based on what Nicolas just shared and also Juan Manuel, we know that technological innovation, as I asked Juan Manuel, is not a risk-averse process. We also know that the legislative process is not very open to the risk inherent to the technological and innovation process. How can you make these two universes, these two dimensions present in a digital-ready parliament dialogue? How can the legislative process adhere to a highly risky environment as of the digital transformation?
Well, Luís, while I do acknowledge that the legislative process is usually a risk-averse environment in terms of procedures, I do think that in Brazil, in speaking specifically about our Brazilian National Congress, Federal Congress, the aversion to technology was not that big of a deal. As I said, there was a process of digitalisation and modernization of our procedures that was already going on before the pandemic. So the Senate's website was completely renovated in the last years, and all of these innovations are connected to something I think Manuel mentioned, which is transparency. It does give the politicians, it does give the congressmen and congresswomen the feeling that they're being more accountable, more transparent, and thus earning political gains out of these changes. So I don't think that the risk aversion towards technology here in Brazil was something that serious. But I would say your question is a little bit abstract in terms of what's going to happen in the future. I will try to hand out a more concrete answer by illustrating or analyzing a concrete situation that is going on right now. It's actually on my TV screen here. Over the last weeks, the Brazilian Supreme Court published a decision mandating the president of the Senate to create an investigation committee. This was all over the news, and I think this is a widely reported fact. And once this happened, it sparked a whole series of questions about the work of the committee. I mean, how the committee would work. Is it possible to have a remote investigation committee? Is it possible to inquire and interrogate witnesses and authorities remotely? Does it have the same, not only legal, certainty and validity, but also does it have the same political impact and social impact in terms of getting the truth out there or keeping the executive branch in check, as you mentioned before. And we were struggling to answer all of these questions, especially because the creation of the committee was due to a decision from the judiciary. So we were not entirely ready to put the whole thing to work. But the truth is that, and as Nicolas stated, the future is hybrid. The committee is basically holding in-person meetings with, I would say, 20 to 30% of the members participating in a remote way. So I think that despite all the difficulties, the committee does provide us a fair, a good idea of what it's going to be like in the future. We have, 70, 80% of the members asking questions to the authorities or to the witnesses in person, and some 20, 30% of them are working from their home states or whatever place they are right now. The key point here is, for me, is that we were able to make the politicians, the staffers, comfortable with technology. The platform is very intelligible, it's easy to use, and we basically, I would say, is our strategy as permanent civil servants in the parliament, is to make the system prove its worth. We don't want to push things because we think just because we think it is better. We need to make everyone comfortable with the changes, including and especially including the general public. I think that everyone, and this was mentioned before, understands that the more transparent parliaments are, the more reliable they are, and the more legitimate they become within the society. So I think that technology plays a very important role in this sense. And this is the way I see we can adjust the risk aversion versus the needs of the new times we're seeing right now. It's not unnecessary to always remember that most of the changes in our internal statutes and bylaws are a result of or are a formalization of parliamentarian practices adopted, through the years that became, formal rules or formal institutions within the parliament. So I think this is basically what we will see happening with remote deliberation system and new technologies within the parliament. And the more comfortable politicians become using them, the more used general public become. The general public will become with the transparency and all the resources these new technologies provide. The easier it will be for us to implement them as permanent changes, as permanent institutions within the parliament.
Thank you, Gustavo, for your remarkable considerations. I'd like to follow up on what Gustavo just shared with you, Nicolas. We also share our thoughts with colleagues from different parliaments that private entrepreneurs can greatly improve the effectiveness of the legislative digital transformation, either by providing specialized expertise in the legislative process or by services required to its implementation, such as a video conference solution. We also know that the risk of error or malfunction can be greatly reduced by an outsourced solution that has been tested repeatedly internally and with its users. Based on that, what are Zoom's recommendations for the usage of a video conferencing solution in public hearings, meetings, and remote or hybrid sessions, and for the full integration into the legislative process?
I think maybe the best way to frame my answer will be to focus on some important security tips.
which may or may not be obvious, but I think it's important to get them out because Zoom is a very secure platform, but it's important that the people who are running the event understand how to use its basic and frankly easy to use safety tools. But it's important to be acquainted with how they work, what they can do, and to be able to action them if needed. The first one is make sure that your participants, especially if they're high visibility people, are using secure internet connections. So as an example, I would say an office or a house with a secure Wi-Fi that has a password would be a good example. The second one, which is very important, is make sure that people do not share meeting details on social media or public forums. And this includes the link to the meeting, it includes the meeting ID number, and it includes the password. It's best if only the people who need to have access to that meeting have the link. Thirdly, I would encourage you to always use passwords and waiting rooms. And if possible, block the room so that nobody else can join after the necessary amount of people are there. As I mentioned earlier, in the near future, you'll be able to check if someone in the waiting room is who they say they are, just by seeing the little icon of their video feed. A fourth tip is to make sure that the meeting host is always online and aware of how to use the security tools, like the safety tool button that I mentioned earlier, which allows you to remove a participant, put everyone on mute, block the screen sharing, or several other options. Sometimes I've seen that the meeting host will turn on the meeting and then leave. And I think that's not the right approach when dealing with very high visibility people. We've seen even that the people on the meeting can make mistakes while they're on camera. So for example, some people may be talking on the telephone while they're on the Zoom call, and that's just because they haven't muted their microphone. And it's good that the administrator, the host can be there to mute it for them. The fifth one is to always think about how you control the screen sharing capabilities. As the admin or the host of the meeting, you have power over who can share the screen and who can't, and when they can and when they can't. So consider the context of this meeting. Is it important that more than one person shares their screen? Is it not? Should nobody be sharing their screen? You can configure that in the settings and also within the main meeting window. In sixth place, I'd suggest something that's really important. And our founder and CEO, Eric Juan, actually published an important article on this week, which is think about the well-being and quality of life of the people in the meetings. Don't do things in the virtual world, which I realize is immersive and it's much more productive, that you wouldn't do in the real world. So I would advise, for instance, to schedule breaks frequently during meetings, or especially between meetings. And finally, think about interpretation. Many of the countries in this region have more than one important language, and it may be the case that many constituents in a certain country speak a different language from the one that's being used in the parliament or in the discussions or in the committee. Zoom has, as you can see in this event, a fantastic interpretation tool, and it's very easy to use. So I would invite you to think about when we consider more inclusive democratic discussions in the new legislative digital transformation space, perhaps it's relevant for certain parliamentarians to be able to broadcast their speech in more than one language. And of course, you can use Zoom for that. For any more tips, I invite you to follow our Zoom blog and also just to get in touch with me if you have any questions. I'd love to be involved in this space, and I'm always willing to answer any questions you may have. As I mentioned earlier, I'm just amazed at how well you've transitioned from the completely face-to-face world to the digital world, in the case of Brazil, in 7 days. And I want to see if Zoom has anything else, any other ways that we can contribute.
Thank you, Nicolas, for your considerations. Most of them we have actually saw as a concern for IT teams across the globe, actually implementing remote deliberation solutions. It's very helpful to hear your thoughts on these. And I'd like to ask Alisha the final question of our debate today. Alisha, we have seen during the debate today that the transition to a digital-ready legislature requires an effort and investment on the adaptation of different political and even historical processes. My final question to you is, why? Why should a legislature undergo the modernization process through the digital transformation?
I think both Gustavo and Juan Manuel gave you a very kind of practical, realistic expectation for how this is going to happen, right? I thought it was really telling, Gustavo, like when you said it's true, it's really about as the parliamentarians become comfortable, right? And as we've had the opportunity to test some of these tools, they will become more comfortable to understand how these can be a part of their work going forward. But I don't think modernization, or I would argue that modernization is broader than just digital transformation, because modernization efforts focus on improving the way that parliaments work to better serve citizens, and some of which are not actually digital processes. This said, like we're saying, digital transformation plays a key role in modernization because many of our interactions these days are happening in digital sphere. We would really like to see from Parlamericas, and I think the way forward here is that parliaments have an opportunity to use these tools to really improve the effectiveness of Parliament's work and its accessibility to citizens. And both Gustavo and Juan Manuel have referenced this. We frame it ourselves as a part of our open Parliament programming. One of the most relevant issues that is affecting our democracies right now is disinformation. So having an effective digital strategy in place that strengthens the transparency and communication of accurate information about the work of Parliament can play an important role in countering this phenomena, and it'll be critical to upholding public trust in the Parliament. It's a phenomena that has to be addressed not only at the national level, but also at the regional and global levels, given its complex nature, the international use of social media platforms, which have been the most common channel for the dissemination of disinformation. Parlamericas continues to provide a space to advance collaboration and dialogue to identify the necessary measures to counter this threat to democracy, including legislation and oversight practices, as well as parliamentary operational practices to better position parliaments to contribute to this fight. So recently, social conflicts in the region, which in some cases have led to processes of institutional reform, we believe open a space to rethink how Parliament's digital strategies can help strengthen its accountability and provide further opportunities for citizen participation that might contribute to preventing future similar conflicts and, in turn, to facilitate fruitful dialogues among different stakeholders. As I mentioned previously, the emergence of ICTs and social network platforms have altered the way in which people interact, which has been exacerbated by the pandemic given restrictions established in countries to limit the spread of COVID-19. Therefore, digital strategies have to respond to these new forms of interaction and ensure that, for example, information provided by the Parliament is using clear and simple language and is focused on citizens' interests and their needs. It can be helpful for these to be aligned with an institutional communication strategy used by all departments when it comes to sharing information about parliamentary work. It's also important to consider challenges that parliaments are facing to adopt digital strategies to modernize their processes. And some of the challenges identified by participants in the recent meeting that we did that I mentioned of the Parliamentary Network on Open Parliament included cultural obstacles, which sometimes limit space for innovation. For instance, and I believe it was Juan Manuel who mentioned like parliamentarians prefer paper. So there's a certain level of digital illiteracy that we're overcoming, and that the pandemic has given an opportunity, as Gustavo mentioned, for parliamentarians to gain these skills and become more comfortable. There's the limited financial and staff resources, which is real in I would say all parliaments. I mean, currently now with the pandemic in all countries, right? This is really constraining kind of the fiscal space in which governments and parliaments work in. But in particular, in the smaller parliaments in this hemisphere, speaking of even, and then even more particularly the Caribbean parliaments, which are particularly stretched this way and lack resources, it's a really important consideration for how we're going to come up with develop tools or systems. I would even look to possibly thinking of how Zoom could and other companies could think of ways on how to kind of bridge this gap for some of these institutions that just won't have the same resources, both staff or financial, to kind of make the same transitions that we're talking about here, which we've all agreed could benefit our democracies or will benefit our democracies and our parliaments. The lack of continuity of political support because of electoral and parliamentary cycles, this is another challenge that we have to keep in consideration as we look at the modernization plans in parliaments. There's also the limited internet infrastructure and connectivity throughout the hemisphere. We don't want to create this disparity between people who then get to have access, get to participate effectively. And this even goes for within parliaments, parliamentarians. And it's interesting, even in a place like Canada, it has been a conversation where we have parliamentarians who are from very remote parts of the country who are concerned that in the move to hybrid or the using these tools, but does that put them at a disadvantage if they're in a part of the country that doesn't have the same level of connectivity as their colleagues? Therefore, it's important for these digital transformation strategies to address these challenges so that these efforts do become sustainable over time. Parliaments, as we've all said, are traditional institutions, and strengthening them is fundamental for our democracies. We've seen a lot of modernization over the last few years in the region, with the significant acceleration due to the pandemic, like in the Congress of Argentina. As I've said, Brazil has really been a leader in this space, and we've often looked to them to look at the practices they're adopting and the good, and they've been wonderful about sharing that across the hemisphere, across the world. It's inspiring to see this progress based on a recognition that there's a need to adapt parliamentary functions to this new era. And so at Parlamericas, we look forward to continuing to create a space to exchange these good practices and to continue supporting these advancements in the parliaments in our hemisphere. And we feel so fortunate to have a partner like you at Bússola Tech that allows us to also have this space to also share as well. So I'm grateful again, Luís, for this opportunity.
Juan Manuel, I'd like to pose a last question, and of course, if you like, you can post your closing remarks as well. Technological innovation, Juan Manuel, is not a risk-averse process, quite the opposite. Error is a fundamental part of building expertise through constant testing of hypotheses and errors. Academic production place the legislative houses as late adopters of technological tools due to their aversion to the risk of error, as well as the speed inherent in the decision-making process that seeks to build consensus. I'd like to focus on your area of expertise, the legislative process. In your view, what are the ways to equalize risk aversion inherent to the legislative process with the technological innovation applied in its management?
Creo que lo respondí recién, a ir creciendo y tanto el cuerpo político, que son los que están 4 años y se van, y los que están hace 20 años en la Cámara, creo que fue un aprendizaje en conjunto, con mucha paciencia, con mucho esfuerzo, con un esfuerzo también muy grande de trabajar en auto-hackearnos, en hacer pentesting, un trabajo de ciberseguridad muy importante, porque en los 91 proyectos que recién les comenté que se aprobaron estuvo el presupuesto nacional, el acuerdo con el Fondo Monetario Internacional, un trabajo también en la cuestión tributaria muy importante, votaciones que se dieron con un solo voto de diferencia. Creo que eso requirió mucha transparencia y abrir el proceso de aprendizaje para que estas nuevas herramientas sean tomadas en serio y que las leyes tengan el poder y la fuerza de ley para poder trabajarse. Creo que eso se dio en todas las áreas. Obviamente hay áreas, voy a poner 2 ejes. Nosotros tenemos una vertical de trabajo legislativo parlamentario con gente de muchos años de antigüedad, con procesos y con también una expertise muy importante, que fueron quizás los que más les costó incorporar tecnología porque creían que se intervenía y perdían poder en este trabajo, rápidamente mostrando que podían trabajar desde su casa con la misma eficiencia y quizá con mejores tiempos y mejor performance, digamos. Eso fue algo que vino, como les decía, para quedarse y va a quedar instaurado. Y por otro lado, una vertical más administrativa, que tiene que ver con el funcionamiento de la Cámara, la logística, que todo funcione. También, obviamente, que más del 90% de los trabajadores están en su casa y ellos quizá tuvieron algo mucho más fácil de incorporar con sistemas que fuimos trabajando. Y después el propiamente dicho, que es el recinto virtual, que fue un desarrollo y una programación propia, al mismo tiempo que la comisión virtual de trabajo legislativo durante la semana, como les decía. Así que fue un ida y vuelta, sigue habiendo resistencias y es un aprendizaje continuo el de poder explicar y convencer de que la tecnología mejora, transparenta y permite, como les decía antes, hacer más visible el trabajo y el esfuerzo de todos los trabajadores legislativos.
Thank you, Juan Manuel. Thank you for your consideration and thank you for your participation today. It was a pleasure. Thank you. Sadly, we are reaching the end of our debate today. It was actually a pleasure to be your moderator. So I'd like to open the space for your closing remarks. Gustavo, would you like to share your final thoughts with us today?
Well, again, I would like to thank you for the opportunity of sharing and learning from all of my fellow panelists. This was a very profitable experience, and it is really meaningful, as I said in the beginning, during these times when we are facing challenges that are common to pretty much every parliament on earth. But I do think it is also meaningful because we're now starting to see a little bit over the pandemic, and we're starting to give a little more thought on how things are going to be after this situation ends. So this is also very important for us to share and understand what are the resources and how can we, as Alisha said on her last remarks, how can parliaments better serve people, not only through technology, but especially through better practices and more with more transparency. Again, thank you, Juan Manuel, Alisha, Nicolas, and you, Luís. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Gustavo, for your participation today. Nicolas, would you like to share your final thoughts with us as well?
Sure, Luís. I'll be very brief. I wanted to thank you for the invitation, thank my fellow panelists. As I mentioned, this is just the beginning of a conversation of how legislative debates in general can be kept alive and well in the hybrid future that awaits us, hopefully not too long from here. And just wish that everybody's doing well. These are very difficult times for most people in most countries in this hemisphere. And I just hope that everyone watching this webinar is well and their families are well. I look forward to continuing the conversation, not only with the people here today, but with other members of Parliament who may be looking to see how Zoom can contribute to making their work even more digital in the future.
Thank you, Nicolas. Alisha, would you like to share your final thoughts with us as well?
Thank you. Look, I just want to draw attention to the fact that our efforts made in the last decade by parliaments of the region have also been focused on strengthening legislative openness. And so this is a fundamental point because it's not about innovating for the sake of innovating, but about ensuring that there is a closer relationship between parliaments and citizens with improved and better opportunities for public engagement. This is the engine and the reason behind these initiatives, and this must be considered within digital transformation strategies. We look forward to continuing to work with important leaders in this space, such as my colleagues here today. Brazil and Argentina continue to show leadership in the hemisphere as it relates to digital innovation in their parliaments, as well as in the open parliament space. He's no longer here to hear me applaud him, but I do want to take note that Argentina did recently publish its Open Parliament Action Plan, and we are looking forward to learning about their experiences as they implement it. And I want to close by just saying Parlamericas offers a space for collaboration between parliamentarians and parliamentary staff to contribute and support these efforts by bringing them together to exchange experiences, along with other important stakeholders that can provide expertise around certain topics aligned with Parlamericas' priority areas, which are open parliament, gender equality, and climate change. So it's a really, as I said, Luís, a great pleasure to take part in this panel. We hope to continue this dialogue. I'm delighted to meet Nicolas, who now I know he speaks Spanish, Portuguese, and English. And so when I have parliaments asking for my help on how to use Zoom, I can say, actually, I've got the guy for you.
Absolutely.
So again, as always, thank you for the opportunity. It's been wonderful.
Thank you, Alisha. Thank you, Nicolas. Thank you, Gustavo. Thank you, Juan Manuel, for the incredible debate today. For us at Bússola Tech, it's always a pleasure to create this space of collaboration and cooperation between legislatures, both at the national and subnational level, and also entrepreneurs from the private sector, such as Nicolas here today, providing us incredible tools to help also to maintain legislative activities, but also to improve them. It's always a pleasure to have you here on the debate, Alisha, Nicolas. Hopefully we can get further debate with you as well. So thank you for today's debate, and we finish here for today. Thank you.